London has some seriously odd-looking skyscrapers with some very unserious nicknames. The Gherkin, the Scalpel, Can of Ham, the Cheesegrater, the Walkie Talkie. But buildings this large and this expensive in the heart of one of the world's most important cities don't just happen by accident. So, how did these skyscrapers end up with such unique designs? I'm Nick Kotz, I'm an architect, and today we're taking a walking tour of London's most interesting skyscrapers. To understand why these buildings look the way they do, first we need to understand three major factors about building in the City of London. First, unlike some other major cities around the world, London doesn't have a uniform street grid. Each lot has a unique shape and unique dimensions. Some lots are rectangular, others are triangular, some are just bizarre. Secondly, in addition to, or maybe because of these irregular lot sizes, what gets built on them is subject to a huge amount of negotiation. In a city like New York, there's a defined buildable envelope that regulates the bulk, the shape, the size, the height of new buildings. London doesn't have those sorts of rules, so every new large building that impacts the skyline is up to negotiation. And the third factor is that within the square mile of the City of London, there were no skyscrapers until the 1980s. Before the 1980s, nothing this tall could legally be built in the historic square mile of the center of London.
We are right over the centre of the hub of the world, the City of London. No view of London would be complete without a view of Sir Christopher Wren's masterwork, historic old St. Paul's.
These buildings only started going up when those laws were changed, and actually the political organization of the city changed to enable it. And so for the first time, with the creation of the Greater London Authority, London had something it hadn't had before, a mayor. And given the trend towards globalization that was occurring, the new London plan saw the opportunity to cement London as a global financial capital with a downtown. So in the London plan, there's no clear definition about what a tall building is, only a somewhat puzzling statement about the higher the building, the greater the scrutiny. But they did, however, create a framework of 5 major tenets that would feed into the approval process for any major tall building. The functional impact, the visual impact, the cumulative impact, the environmental impact, and public access. This is 30 St. Mary Axe, known to many as the Gherkin because it looks like, well, a pickle. But there's actually a good reason why it looks like this. This was designed by Lord Norman Foster and completed in 2001. This was designed to be a symbol of sustainability. And 30 St. Mary Axe really leaned into the idea of environmental impact as the path towards approval, simply through its formal massing. The rounded shape, the curves, minimize wind at the base of the building, which was a really crucial thing for the regulatory agency to get behind. And the second of these was really about the performance of the building in terms of environmental responsibility and trying to minimize the use of fossil fuels to heat and air condition in the way that you typically would in a glass enclosed rectangular skyscraper. So if you look at the black stripes running up the building, within those are multi-story atriums. And these were meant to allow airflow to move up and through the building, almost like a chimney. And in addition to that, there were windows that were designed to open and shut to allow air to move in and through the building, minimize the use of air conditioning. Also, if you look closely at the building, you don't see any louvers, and they achieved this shape and this sleekness by actually moving the cooling towers and the heating plant to an adjacent 6-story building. So even though the building communicates sustainability, its performance is still very much traditional and just hidden. This is the Leadenhall building, which some people have taken to calling the Cheesegrater. This building was designed by Richard Rogers and Partners, and it was completed in 2013. The design here might look like an odd choice, but it makes a lot more sense if you look at it up against another building. St. Paul's Cathedral is just a few blocks away, and the shape of the Leadenhall building is actually a gesture of respect, looking back towards St. Paul's Cathedral. So thinking back to the approval guidelines in the City of London for a tall building, the visual impact is one of these core tenets, and this is the one that the Leadenhall building really leaned into. Across London, there are these protected view corridors, essentially making sure that St. Paul's is visible from various vantage points across the entire metropolitan region. And these view corridors, in the approval for any tall building, need to be kept clear, both in front and behind.
working on top of London's tall buildings is not the most comfortable of jobs. But when the sun shines and the air's clear, the views around and below are well worth compensations. Looking across London, St. Paul's stands out with proud dignity.
So the Leadenhall building, by leaning away from one of these protected viewpoints, freed up one of these views, and it enabled the building to be quite tall. And there's also a somewhat interesting parallel with this building and another building by Richard Rogers just a few streets away, the Lloyd's of London headquarters, which is almost an extreme version of an inside-out building with exterior stairs and a fairly wacky exterior shape. Leadenhall building kind of simplifies. It's almost like a mature version of the same sort of idea. You have your very functional office floor plate with all of the mechanical guts stuck on the outside of it. Only here it's only on one side to essentially maximize the efficiency of these rectangular floor plates, as opposed to Lloyd's, which is a little bit more artful and composed with the distribution of stairs and ductwork. And this is a very British through line of modern architecture, going back to, you could even say, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in 1851, which was this exploration of metal and glass and this sort of techno-futurism of British architecture that building really started. But while the Cheesegrater gets smaller towards the top to preserve these historic sightlines, the next building we're going to look at turns that idea upside down, literally. Behind me is 20 Fenchurch, which some people have taken to calling the Walkie Talkie. And this is one of the only skyscrapers in London that you can actually visit the top of for free. That is, if you can get a ticket. The building was designed by Raphael Vignoli. It was completed in 2015. And if you notice, the top of this building is larger than the base, which is quite unusual for a tall building. But these curves are not about preserving historic views. This design is actually a clever way to create a public space within the footprint of a private building. In the London plan, there's actually a requirement for public space. And the magic here is that they've managed to create a total area of public space that's actually bigger than the lot that it's built on. Directly underneath the almost dome at the top of the building is a public park. So it's actually interesting that the top of the building is the size of the lot and the bottom is smaller. It's the opposite of what we're used to when we think of tall buildings that get smaller as you ascend. And because of this essentially trick of geometry, there's about 1.5 times the amount of public space than the lot even contains. One of the other aspects of the visual metrics for any tall building getting permission for the London plan is actually design quality. Because there wasn't a set visual metric that this was assessed against, what the developers ended up doing is actually hired other famous architects, including Jean Nouvel, who did not design this building, to essentially write an ode of praise towards the building design, saying this would be a contribution to generations of Londoners to build this quote-unquote masterpiece. And this is just a small bit of what it takes to build a skyscraper in a city like London.